For centuries, the story of the sailor has been one of mythic endurance. We picture figures carved from granite, men who face the vast indifference of the ocean and return stories of triumph. Early accounts, whether etched into ship logs or rendered in grand 17th-century engravings, consistently painted a portrait of stoicism. The mariner was expected to be brave, resilient, almost superhuman. He endured scurvy, brutal storms, and the constant threat of mutiny with quiet fortitude. Yet when we sift through this historical record, the journals, the poetic epics, the artistic depictions, a curious silence emerges. Where are the raw edges of terror? If faced with plague-ridden ports or the sheer psychological weight of weeks without land, why is fear so conspicuously absent from their written narrative? This omission suggests more than mere historical oversight. Perhaps fear was considered a weakness to be suppressed, an emotion unworthy of record in a professional life. Or maybe, confronting such profound dread demanded a silence that transcended ink and parchment altogether. Consider the very act of recording. These logs were often official documents designed for posterity and command. Fear in that professional sphere was simply too volatile a commodity to commit to paper. The records we do possess speak less of existential dread than they do of physical hardship. The sheer brutality of life at sea presented threats so immediate: scurvy, dysentery, the constant threat of cannon fire. That fear was often relegated to the realm of the purely physiological. When a sailor succumbed to disease or injury, the logs tended to record the symptoms: fever, delirium, gangrene. Psychological anguish, however, was frequently pathologized. Breakdown might be noted as melancholy or excessive spirits, diagnoses that subtly shifted blame from the environment to the individual's character. Fear, therefore, could be dismissed not just as an emotion, but as a moral failing, a sign of weakness unworthy of official documentation. The trauma was real, yet its emotional dimensions were systematically edited out of history. Consider the disciplinary logs. Mutiny was often framed as madness, a failure of discipline rather than desperation. The institutional focus remained on maintaining order and physical capability. This systemic erasure meant that while we know they lived in terror, the language to describe it, the internal landscape of fear, was deemed too volatile for official record. The reality of life aboard a vessel was governed by an unforgiving social contract. Survival depended not just on seamanship, but on rigid adherence to military discipline. The ship was a microcosm of the state, and its order was maintained through fear, the palpable threat of flogging, or the ultimate consequence of court-martial. To express personal fear, doubt, or even complaint was therefore not merely an emotional indulgence. It was interpreted as a breach of operational readiness. It suggested weakness, a failure to perform one's duty under duress. In this highly structured environment, individual emotion had to be subordinated entirely to the collective function. The sailors were expected to operate with disciplined stoicism, presenting a facade of unwavering competence regardless of their internal state. This performance was mandatory. Deviate from it, and you risked not only punishment but profound social ostracization, effectively damning your career and reputation within that brutal, confined world. This enforced silence was crucial for maintaining morale and operational efficiency. A visible breakdown in discipline could cascade through the crew, threatening the entire voyage. Thus, fear became a private burden, swallowed deep beneath the uniform's starch. When we turn our attention to the written record, the journals, the letters back home, the official reports, a different kind of silence emerges. This was not merely operational discipline, it was a literary filter. The sailor writing these accounts understood his audience: patrons, military officers, or publishers seeking marketable tales of adventure. To be published meant to succeed in this carefully constructed performance of masculinity and endurance, emotional vulnerability. The raw confession of terror or despair risked undermining that narrative duty. Such disclosures were often viewed as unseemly, perhaps even unprofitable, detracting from the heroic arc required for successful memoir. The sailor had to craft not just an account of events, but a compelling story, one that emphasized grit and stoicism over sheer panic. This necessity to perform heroism in print shaped what we see, leaving much of the true internal turmoil unwritten, or at least heavily curated. The resulting texts favor action over introspection, focusing on navigational feats or skirmishes. This selective emphasis suggests that survival itself was often framed as a testament to willpower rather than mere luck. The problem may not have been the fear itself, but the language available to describe it. To articulate dread requires more than just acknowledging danger. It demands a vocabulary for profound internal states, for existential anxiety, or the slow erosion of loneliness that settles deep in the bone. Did early modern English possess such words, or were they limited by practical concerns, survival, navigation, and immediate physical threat? The available lexicon often prioritized concrete actions over abstract emotional landscapes. We find terms for grief or melancholy, but these frequently carry connotations of domestic loss or seasonal change, not the unique, crushing void faced between latitudes. It is possible that without precise linguistic tools, words that could capture the specific ache of profound isolation on an endless ocean, the deepest anxieties remained unspeakable. Relegated to silence and gesture rather than ink, the very structure of their language may have imposed a limit on the emotional depth they felt capable of recording. Consider the absence of modern psychological terms: anomie, existential dread. These voids required specialized language that simply did not exist in their dictionaries. Their silence might. The sheer difficulty of documenting such deep-seated terror suggests we must look beyond the logbooks and official correspondence. The true record of fear, it seems, was private, held within oral tradition, whispered around a sputtering lantern flame. These weren't narratives intended for posterity or even for the captain's ledger. They were survival mechanisms, passed down through shared glances, coded idioms, and carefully modulated silence. A sailor might not write "I fear death," but he could describe the uncanny stillness of the fog, or the unsettling geometry of a wave cresting two heighty tales that carried immense emotional weight to those who lived it. These fears were often woven into folklore, embellishing tales of monstrous currents or vengeful spirits, making them indistinguishable from mere adventure stories. The historical record thus becomes a mosaic, official accounts detailing latitude and longitude, while the deepest anxieties reside in the unwritten poetry of memory. These anxieties survived in fragmented letters, a mention of the deep or a sudden refusal to speak of certain latitudes. Such coded language allowed fear to persist outside official scrutiny, preserved only by the selective memory of those who dared to remember. The psychological toll of prolonged isolation and deprivation was immense. When physical resources dwindled, when scurvy set in or rations became dangerously scarce, the stress didn't manifest as articulate fear, but often as explosive desperation. Mutiny, therefore, must be viewed not simply as an act of calculated rebellion against authority, but perhaps as a catastrophic system failure, the breakdown of social order under unsustainable psychological pressure. The men were pushed past endurance, their despair finding expression in violence rather than confession. Their deepest anxieties, the fear of the unknown abyss, the dread of permanent loss, were too raw, too consuming for polite description. They could only speak to survival itself, and that language was often blood and force. Consider the sheer weight of that silence. The fear was internalized, a constant gnawing presence beneath the bravado. It manifested in paranoia, suspicion of the cook, distrust of the captain's motives, and physical ailments like violent fevers or sudden bouts of delirium. These were not mere symptoms. They were the body's desperate attempt to externalize an unbearable psychological burden, leaving their deepest terrors unspoken and unrecorded. The sheer weight of that silence suggests something deeper than simple fear. It points toward a cultural mandate. In many early modern societies, suffering was not merely endured. It was often viewed as an inherent component of masculine virtue, particularly within the context of adventure or service. The sailor's life, with its inherent dangers and brutal discipline, provided a perfect crucible for this expectation. To complain openly, to admit paralyzing fear, risk being seen not just as weak, but as fundamentally unmanly. This cultural pressure meant that stoicism was less an emotional state than it was a survival mechanism. The man learned to wear his terror like another layer of rough clothing, visible only through the strain around his eyes or the tightness in his jaw. His silence, therefore, might not be interpreted as an absence of fear, but rather as a highly practiced form of conformity to a deeply ingrained social expectation. Consider the blacksmith's forge or the soldier's march. These roles similarly demanded a public performance of resilience. Their shared ordeal created an unspoken code. Survival was measured by silence, making the open confession of dread unthinkable. The evidence suggests that the silence was not merely an absence of fear, but rather a complex social mechanism. It was a highly disciplined performance, dictated by the rigid expectations of maritime society and the literary conventions of the time. To openly confess terror would have been to violate the unspoken code of endurance, a failure of masculine stoicism. The sailors were performing for their peers, creating an internal narrative where resilience superseded vulnerability. This silence, therefore, becomes its own kind of historical document. It tells us more about the culture that endured the voyage than it does about the terror itself. The true story of these early modern voyages is not found in the shouts or the screams, but in the meticulous gaps, the unwritten chapters preserved by the very act of silence. Consider the logbooks themselves, factual records prioritizing navigation over emotion. This professional detachment wasn't just habit, it was a survival strategy. The sea demanded competence, and in that demanding space, emotional vulnerability was simply too costly to record. Thus, their silence remains the most profound testament